We come now to Genesis chapter 37, which it's another one of those times and places where it's vitally important for us to remember that these are real flesh and blood people that we're being told about here. It's one of those stories that we're familiar with, one of those places where in Sunday school we're taught about the heroic young man and all the hardship that he went through and how he stayed faithful, and all of that's true. But again, because we know the rest of the story, we sort of skip lightly over the depth of the hardship that he went through. And the story is, of course, the story of Joseph as it relates to his brother before he ends up in Egypt. Now, one of the simple and obvious and clear lessons that we ought to draw from this, if we're going to sort of reduce this stuff down to a moralistic lesson, one of those lessons is polygamy just doesn't work very well. I mean, there is some serious broken relationships going on in this family that I think can be traced back to these multiple wives, and at some level back to the sin of Laban against Jacob. Well, Jacob also has his own sins to worry about. You'll remember, and it's kind of striking, isn't it, that there's some level of hypocrisy here, that Jacob struggled with the fact that his brother Esau was more favored by his father Isaac, and that led to the trickery and that went on in Jacob's getting of the blessing from his father. Well, now here's Jacob, an older man who is also playing favorites, not between two twins, but among the 12 sons that he had been blessed with. And Joseph is the one who receives this special treatment, this coat of many colors. And boy, howdy, it must have really fed the bitterness and the anger and the frustration in the hearts and minds of his brothers, which then brings us to one of those questions that often comes up when men get together and sit in their easy chairs and smoke their pipes and explore various and sundry biblical questions. And the question here is, does Joseph have any of the blame for what happened? The reality is that for the rest of the story of Joseph, which is quite lengthy, but for the rest of the story of Joseph, we're going to see Joseph faced with all manner of hardships, and we're going to see him respond well each and every time. We're going to see him do well. But at the beginning of the story, that's where the question lies. And specifically, the question is this: was Joseph prideful, insensitive, in some way at fault for sharing the dreams that he had, first with his brothers and then secondly with his brothers and his father? Was there a sort of tone of delight, almost a mocking of the brothers for their relative insignificance and a boasting of his own significance? Or do we want to take the position simply that Joseph was profoundly naive, that he should have known that this was going to be offensive to those that he spoke to, and just sort of being socially innocent, he didn't realize that and shared freely, and bad things came of it? I'm not sure what position to take. I think it's hard for me to imagine being in Joseph's shoes, having those dreams and telling those dreams with absolute innocence. I can see if I was innocent and I had this dream and I didn't understand it, I can see going to one older brother or going to my father and being kind of sheepish and embarrassed and saying, look, I had this dream. I'm not sure what to think. I want to make sure I'm not misreading it. But here's what happened. Maybe it means nothing. What do you think? And I think that kind of an approach, that kind of a posture, would have gone a long way to alleviating the frustration and anger of his brothers. But that's not what he did. It seems, and again, I could be some level of reading into the text, but it seems like he's taking pleasure in announcing this dream, and especially given the fact that the second dream, after he's already annoyed and irritated his brothers, who he should probably recognize and realize have some latent hostility, maybe not so latent hostility toward him. And yet, when he has the second dream, he doesn't seem again to have any hesitation to tell it, not just to the brothers, but to his father as well. And his father's like, what in the world? What gives? What? Do you really think this is going to happen? Isn't that interesting? Have you ever wondered about how these patriarchs saw themselves relative to each other? I get a lot of people who are worried for me about the burden that I have to carry of being the son of R.C. Sproul, that living in his shadow is supposed to be one of the great hardships and challenges and difficulties of my life. Well, I've had a standard response to those who express that concern. I tell them I'm perfectly comfortable in my father's shadow because both of us realize that we are in Jesus's shadow, that there is no competition. I've also described it this way. Many people don't know this, but back when I lived in Orlando, there were a couple of brothers who happened to be on basketball scholarships to play for the University of Central Florida, the largest university in Orlando. They'd received these basketball scholarships to play on the team, and these two brothers had as their father one Michael Jordan, who I would argue has a very good case as the greatest basketball player ever. Well, these two boys were good basketball players. They were good enough basketball players to receive basketball scholarships to a Division I school. But nobody would ever expect them to be Michael Jordan. And whatever gifts God may have given me, no one can expect me to measure up to my father. It'd just be crazy because he's just one of a kind. Now, I say all that because it just dawns on me that not only do we see Jacob repeating the error of his father Isaac, but then I wonder about when Jacob responds to this dream about Joseph with offense, if they sort of see themselves, these patriarchs, in a competition for, spiritual significance. Is Abraham more important than Isaac? Is Isaac more important than Jacob? If so, if Jacob's receiving this, if Jacob's saying to himself, look, I'm perfectly willing to receive the bronze medal, that's quite an honor, but now along comes his son, in some level suggesting by the dream that he's going to supplant him, is going to get bumped off the stand there and not get his medal. Or did maybe they think, not that the first one, Abraham, the first of the patriarchs, would be the greatest of them, but maybe they thought, I don't know, they were, that Isaac was more important than Abraham and that Jacob was more important than Isaac. And then face to face with the possibility that Joseph's going to be more important than Jacob, maybe they, I don't know. I don't know how that all worked. I do know that God the Holy Spirit, in inspiring Moses to write down these words, is telling us and is willing to enter into the distorted and broken dynamics within the family. And we're going to see more of that broken and distorted dynamic of the family in our next chapter as well. But in this chapter, we're not facing enslavement by the Egyptians. We're not facing Goliath and the Philistine army. We're not facing exile by the Babylonian Empire. In some ways, you would think this would be, a golden age. But even in the midst of this time of relative peace, there's not only broken familial relationships, there's broken familial relationships that lead very nearly to fratricide, to the murder of one's own brother. I don't know. I wasn't there. But I almost feel like, hey, maybe what happened here is, one of the irritated brothers sees Joseph coming and just sort of floats this trial balloon, maybe as a joke, maybe unsure about whether it would be a joke or not. Hey, here comes Joseph. Maybe we should kill him. And instead of everybody laughing and saying, yeah, that would serve him right, they end up ratcheting up their rhetoric till they get to the place where they're planning to do it. And along comes Reuben, and he thinks, well, the way to avoid this is to postpone it, and I can play for some time, and I'll have opportunity to rescue him. So they put Joseph in the pit, and then I'm not sure where Reuben ends up being, but now comes these traders, these Amalekites that are on their way to Egypt, and Judah now stands up ready to do the best he can to rescue his younger brother by suggesting, hey, let's not murder him. It's interesting, the relative import they all gave to different ways of having him die. When they put him in the pit, they thought, oh, this will be better than killing him because then we won't shed any of his blood. But he'll be just as dead because of their decisions anyway. Now it's even further. Hey, we're not going to kill him at all. We're going to send him into slavery. We'll be rid of him. He won't be a problem. And it happens. I think it was probably someone long before Chuck Colson, but Chuck Colson would have likely agreed that more often than not, the cover-up is worse than the crime. It is a terrible thing to be sold into slavery. It's especially a terrible thing to be sold into slavery by one's own brothers because of the brother's hatred of you. But how much worse is it to then determine that, well, here's how we'll explain this. We won't go home and tell our father, we're so sorry, we lost our temper, Joseph's been driving us crazy, and so we sold him to some trade. No, we're going to lie to our father and tell him his son is dead. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some hostility towards the father as well. The father is the one who made Joseph the favorite. And so maybe that's what's going on here. That'll show him. Let's bring this coat of many colors that we didn't get, that Joseph got. We'll drip it in blood, and then we'll give some hurt to our dad, who seems to love our brother more than us. Wow. That is some cold, hard stuff. But as I said at the beginning, we need to remember that it's real. It actually happened. There's a sense in which this story is in some ways like the story of Oedipus the King, the play written by the Greek playwright Sophocles. In Oedipus the King, you remember, a prophecy is given that the newborn child of the king and the queen will one day kill his father and marry his mother. And wanting to make sure that that prophecy does not come to pass, they decide to kill their own son. But the man charged with that responsibility doesn't have the heart to kill this little baby, so the baby is sent away across the water. He's raised and he grows up not knowing who his real parents are. He travels back to his homeland not knowing it's his homeland. He accidentally kills his father. He comforts his grieving mother not knowing it's his mother and marries her. Well, here now Joseph has this dream, which is like the prophecy about Oedipus. He says this is what it looks like is going to happen. And the brothers are thinking, no, that is not going to happen. We're not going to let that happen. First, they say we're going to kill him. And now, well, we're not going to kill him. We will instead sell him into slavery. And then when he's a slave, there won't be any occasion for us to have to bow down to him. Now, I want you to compare Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. All of them have received a promise from God. Abraham's told you're going to have a son, and Abraham waits and he waits and he waits, and when the son doesn't come, he and his wife come up with this scheme. Let's take another wife with Hagar the maid, and we'll have the child with her. They lost patience in God and his plan and his promise. Abraham, the father of the faithful. Isaac hears the promise of God and that the promise is going to flow through his son Jacob, but he doesn't trust God. He doesn't believe God, and he wants the promise to come through Esau. Jacob, who knows, and his mother as well, who knows that the promise is to come to him, doesn't wait to see how God brings this to pass. Instead, he descends down into deceit with the help of his mother and tricks his father. Now Joseph, who has been told in a manner of speaking that his brothers will bow down to him, that he is the heir of the promise, gets sold into slavery and does what? He does the right thing. He serves those who are in authority over him. And out of that faithful trust, which we'll look at in the coming weeks, we're going to see that he trusted God, he obeyed God, he honored those in authority over him, and out of that he got to the place where the prophecy is actually fulfilled. But for now, we see Joseph going through a period of humiliation. You know, in my podcast, Jesus Changes Everything, I have a segment about once a week in which I look at the Westminster Shorter Catechism and work my way through those questions and answers. And just the other day, I recorded a segment looking at question 27 that asks, wherein does Christ's humiliation consist? And the answer looks at his being born, his being under the power of death and the curse of mankind, and all the hardship, born in a low condition, all his death for us. All these things are examples of his humiliation that are preceded by his exaltation. Well, that's where Joseph is going right now. He is in the pit. He is sold off as a slave. But he will be lifted up by the true and living God, and the dream that he had given to him by God himself will be brought to pass by God himself. And there's nothing that Joseph's brothers can do to stop it.